It's time to talk about the state of Warzone, because so far we've had a fairly promising release, coupled with some fairly controversial and damaging updates, and a couple of questions around the anti cheat, audio, and other important and critical factors of the game that I think are worth talking about today. We know in 2024 we're going to have a brand new big map or potentially the return of Verdansk. We're going to have the return of Fortune's Keep and Rebirth Island, and the return of rank mode in Warzone. But there's a lot in Warzone right now that I feel currently needs to be discussed because Warzone is in an okay place that could be an excellent place with some tweaks and some changes to how the game development is being approached. Today's content is brought to you today by AOC and their Aegon Pro AG276QZD. This is a brand new Aegon Pro OLED panel that I have been using every single day for Warzone, and it is utterly phenomenal. At 1440p with a 240Hz refresh rate, this OLED monitor is utterly perfect for competitive shooters. It has a 240Hz refresh rate combined with a 0.03 milliseconds response time, and is also G-Sync compatible. Not only do you get the competitive advantages of the high 240Hz refresh rate and the low response time, but you also get all of the incredible benefits of an OLED panel, like inky blacks, high contrast and color, and also lower motion blur and better motion clarity. I've been daily driving this every single day for Call of Duty Warzone and other first-person shooters, and it's been a huge upgrade. So check out the link in the description below. Now, I'm going to start this video with a fairly controversial statement, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. But I actually think Warzone is doing far too much in terms of weapon content. Now, Modern Warfare 2 weapons have already been buried into the dirt for obvious reasons, to make them basically non-usable in the game so that they only have to balance one generation of modern weapons in Modern Warfare 3. And that's fine. But the introduction of more and more conversion kits and more aftermarket parts like this new muzzle brake which gives you crazy amounts of recoil control just seemed like Call of Duty is pandering towards meta extremes in order to provide new content for the game on a weapon standpoint. And I think a lot of this is ultimately just destroying weapon balance in the game. And weapon balance is something we're going to talk about a bit more extensively, but this new muzzle brake is a great example. It is the best muzzle brake in the game that provides huge amounts of recoil control with very few downsides, except for you appearing as an advanced UAV symbol when you fire the gun. Which in my view isn't really a downside, because the advanced UAV symbol hides what floor you're on or whether you're above or below. But the reason this attachment is so problematic and why Warzone I feel is doing too much weapon content is because it basically just means that this attachment is going to take any gun that could be high recoil, high damage, and make it low recoil, high damage. Basically completely eradicating an entire trade-off in the game that meant players who had to have good recoil control, good aim, just don't have to have that anymore. A good example is the Sidewinder. The Sidewinder was effectively a skill cannon assault rifle that had a lot of recoil, but if you hit your shots, it was fairly damaging. Now it has very little recoil when you use this muzzle brake in conjunction with other attachments. And it really just feels like these conversion kits and these attempts at adding more content in terms of weapons to the game, more attachments, more aftermarket parts, are actually at the detriment of the game and not the benefit of the game. And this leads me nicely on to weapon balance. The balance in Warzone is close, but not great. The CQB TTK is still a little too quick, and I still think there needs to be lower hitboxes and lower damage for things like lower torso, legs, and just generally your feet. The amount of time I've died being shot in the legs when I'm shooting somebody in the chest is a little bit problematic, and I think something that could change quite significantly. But I've already touched on this a couple of times on the channel, and the biggest problem with Warzone's balance is they're not reactive enough. The MTZ Interceptor is taking 3 or 4 patches to be balanced correctly, the WSP Swarm, 3 or 4 patches, and generally guns that are statistical outliers take too much time for them to react to. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking, well, there'll always be a meta in Warzone, and you're correct, there always will be a handful of weapons that are better than other weapons, which is why people use them. But it isn't impossible to have an open meta, and it isn't impossible to have an open meta with good trade-offs. There have been perfect examples of that at the end of the Black Ops Cold War integration when we had the Cold War AK, and there were perfect examples of that towards the end of Al Mazrah as well, where you had to choose between high damage and high recoil, or low damage and low recoil, or just guns that had genuine trade-offs for how they worked, but they all fell into the meta. That isn't the case at the moment in the current version of Warzone, and I think certain attachments like this muzzle brake, like these aftermarket parts, are making this problem worse, not better. And I think they need to be more reactive in taking statistical outliers like the MTZ and just burying them into the floor to let something fresh come into the fray and something that's a little bit better. Moving on from weapon balance, we've got to talk about audio, because I've touched on this in numerous videos, and audio in Warzone just isn't good enough. The game, generally speaking, is too loud for things that don't matter. It's too loud for airstrikes. It's too loud for the starter plane animation. It's too loud for just so many scenarios that you don't need audio bleeding your ears out. Warzone is not a military simulation game. It's not a realistic shooter. It's an arcade shooter. And I don't need to hear a plane at 300% volume just because it's a C-130J or it's a helicopter that's a Chinook, so it's naturally loud. I don't need those things. I understand that weapons are supposed to be loud when you fire them, but I also don't need them at 300% volume. And yes, I know an A10 Warthog gun run is a very loud thing to hear, but do I need to hear an airstrike coming in 300 meters across the map? I don't think I need to. The audio mix generally in Warzone could be better. It's a problem that's persisted in pretty much every version of Warzone, and it's something that needs to be improved. Next, we have to talk about Ricochet anti-cheat. Now, anti-cheat is not easy. It is a cat and mouse game of trying to keep up with the worst offenders and getting them banned as quickly as possible. But I do think that there are some things that Call of Duty could still do to their anti-cheat to make the game more protected and work as a better category. I would like to see more two-factor authentications, more tied-in bank accounts or phone numbers in order to get Warzone accounts created in the first place, and a requirement for every account to have 2FA to stop accounts being stolen and being used for cheating. I would also like to see a new category of playlists for players who are new to Warzone. The biggest problem with Warzone are not the accounts that are level 300, 400 that have played the game for the long time. It's players who are making brand new accounts, cheating on those accounts, and getting pretty much scot-free away with it for a period of time, getting banned, and then instantly creating a new account and being straight back into the same player pool. Now yes, you can ban hardware, you can ban IP addresses, but most cheaters and cheating players have ways around this. The simplest solution I see for Warzone is to introduce a level cap, where if you're new to the game, you have to play in a certain playlist up until a certain level. And whilst you're progressing to that certain level, Warzone already has extreme skill-based matchmaking. So people who are cheating and statistically winning games or getting lots of kills are going to end up in the higher skill brackets of SBMM. And if they are in the higher skill brackets of SBMM and they're caught cheating during the process of getting out of that original playlist, then they'll get banned before they can infect the rest of the player pool. Lots of other games do this competitively. Rainbow Six Siege has these systems. Games like CSGO have these systems, and ultimately it just creates a window of time for the anti-cheat to operate, detect accounts, detect cheats, detect injections into the EXE before those players make it into the wider player pool. Now yes, it isn't perfect, but the more hurdles that Call of Duty puts in the way of people cheating in the game, the harder it will be for them, and the more insufferable it will be for people who opt to cheat in the game. I would honestly introduce a playlist where you have to reach past, say, level 60, level 70 in the game before you get to play with everybody else in Warzone, have really strict skill-based matchmaking, and increase the monitoring of Ricochet anti-cheat within those playlists. And between that new account playlist and the shadow banning system, you would probably catch the majority of cheaters and keep them out of the general public player pool. And honestly, I really do feel for console players, and I would say that if all else fails and Ricochet doesn't continue to improve and deal with the cheating situation in Warzone, I would genuinely recommend just having a cross-play only pool that includes just console players. I think it's safe to say that that is a valid option that might have to take place if Ricochet can't keep up with things. Now this next one's a bit of a side curve and a side note generally speaking, but I haven't seen a huge amount of LTMs in Warzone yet, and I understand we're still fairly early, but I think this is something that's worth mentioning now rather than later, because LTMs have never really been a big part of Warzone, and I don't know why. Warzone has had Krampus, it's had zero gravity playlists, it's had playlists where explosives make you fly into the sky, it's had all sorts of wacky and goofy playlists that have actually been a lot of fun. And as long as they are their own playlist and they don't affect the entire game where you can just have to play that mode over and over again, then there's no harm in having more and more LTMs in Warzone. Having a rotational LTM playlist where it's zero gravity, it's double speed, you can only use snipers and shotguns. Stuff like that is a little bit more far afield, but I think it's a lot of fun and I think it's really successful. The Christmas Resurgence LTM didn't change a huge amount for the game, but it did have some cool things that made it at least a little bit interesting and worth trying out. And having a rotational LTM playlist I feel could be huge for Warzone, and considering we're going to have public games, ranked games, and those things running generally in the game, why not have an LTM playlist? The final notes I have to say are related to the actual internal gameplay loop of Warzone, because there are a couple of things that I feel could be better. To start with, I still think the player count is still marginally too low and heavily reliant on respawning factors in the game, as opposed to having a higher player count. I would like to see the player count somewhere closer to 120, and less things like flares, redeploy packs, and other things that just seem to be dependencies for the game to maintain a decent mid-game. I feel at the moment it feels more like Resurgence and less like Battle Royale for the big map, and that's a little bit problematic. Now, whilst I'm not saying we should completely limit or reduce the amount of times you can get people back in the game, I do feel as though there's too much of it right now in the game, and there isn't enough player count for the density of the map. And I know this is a bit more of a stretch for Call of Duty, and editing the map isn't something they do fairly often, but I would like to see more new points of interest that had a bit more focus on larger locations, but less density. I really like the fact that Urzikstan has lots of buildings to move between cover and cover, and I really think that it's catered towards skilled rotational gameplay. But there is something to be said about certain points of interest that are just large and inherently interesting by themselves. Stadium in Verdansk, the Superstore in Verdansk. Although the exterior of these buildings were a little bit annoying to get to and from because they just had no cover, the actual interior and large point of interest was both very memorable and a lot of fun for most people. So maybe getting rid of a certain part of the city and replacing it with a huge stadium, or changing one of the points of interest near the farms to like a huge factory. These are things that would make Urzikstan a more memorable experience and perhaps make it just a little bit more interesting throughout its progression. So folks, that's it for my State of Warzone video so far. I really do feel as though this game has an enjoyable gameplay loop when things are less busted. And I honestly hope that things continue to improve in a positive direction. And I think it is worth remembering that Christmas is the slowest period of time due to developers going on holiday naturally for Christmas like everybody else does. And hopefully we continue to see things trend in the right direction. Season 1 Reloaded was a bit of a disaster. They have managed to fix most of those bugs within 24 hours of that patch releasing and being bugged. But I don't think we want those kinds of updates again in the future. We want solid content updates, solid LTMs, solid changes to the game without breaking the game, and hopefully that's the direction we head in. Let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.